Hi, my name is Amélie, and today I'm going to talk about a joint project which was done at IC Austria about the practicality of multiple environment Markov decision processes, so for short MEMDPs. So first let me start with a brief introduction about MEMDPs. So essentially they are like Markov decision processes which are augmented with the notion of environments or context. Here we have a fixed set of states and possible actions, but we have two different environments, but they have different transition weights and also different reward functions. So formally, how are MEMDP defined? So they're similar to MDPs, but they differ in three aspects. The first one is that we have a set of environments, which is discrete. Second is this set of environments defines different transition functions and different rewards. And finally, we need to have some initial prior on how the environments are distributed. So this allows us to introduce some context into MDPs, and previous work have studied how to obtain winning strategies for MEMDPs. So orthogonal to this, in this work we're going to study how can we use them in practice, in particular how can we do it efficiently. So in particular, one application we're going to focus on here is recommendation systems. So the idea is that we can model a recommender system with a standard MDPs simply by saying that each state is the sequence of choices from the user and the actions are which product to recommend next. So the problem is that if we just use a standard MDP framework, then we have to build a controller which works well for every user. While using MEMDPs here allows us to really have something which can incorporate different user profiles as different environments and can be better tailored to different users. So for instance, in the example on the figure here, you can see that we have two user profiles, a blue and an orange one, where the orange one is someone that will like fantasy and science fiction book, while the blue one is someone that is undecided but really doesn't like science fiction. And so because they have different tastes, we should recommend different products to them. So once we have this kind of setup, the question is how do we solve the problems? How do we solve MEMDPs? So first observations is that MEMDPs are simply subcases of POMDPS. For any MEMDPs, like the one on the left here, you can very easily translate it to a POMDPS. And the way to do it is essentially to consider the cross product between the states and the environments of the MEMDPs. We simply duplicate the states by how many environments we have, and we allocate the transition functions to their respective environments. So because of this, any algorithm that you can use to solve a POMDP can also be used to solve a MEMDP. However, what we show here is that we can develop MEMDP-specific solvers that can significantly improve performance, so both in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of computational and memory efficiency. So here I'm going to briefly go through why this is the case. So the first properties of MEMDPs, which is very useful, is the fact that we can store the transition function efficiently. In MEMDPs, the only unobserved feature is the actual environment. But because of the nature of the problem, the environment is sampled once when we initialize, so based on these prior environments, and then it is kept constant. So this means there is no transitions across environments, and therefore we can store the transition functions more efficiently. So what this means in practice is that the cost of storing the transition functions drops by a factor of I, which means that this is particularly beneficial when we have a lot of environments. So when we have a lot of different contexts we want to capture. A second interesting property is that updating beliefs on the current state or current environments is much faster. So the reason is that in MEMDP we only have uncertainty about the environments, and secondly that, as I mentioned, we have only sparse conditions. And what it means is that rather than having a computation which is quadratic in terms of the states, which would be squared of states times environments, we instead can just do it linearly over only the environments. So finally, the last property concerns the expected entropy of the belief. And what we observe is that this is a decreasing function. So this means that every time we update the belief, our uncertainty about the current environment will decrease. And this is useful because in some algorithm we can actually use this quantity as a heuristic to guide the process. So once we have these properties, then we can import them into standard solvers. So in particular, we're going to look here at first PBVI. And basically, based on the properties I've mentioned before, what we can do is we can do these belief expansion steps in faster and also more memory efficient way. A second solver we looked at is the POMDPS family, so based on Monte Carlo sampling. So first, as for PBVI, we can just use the faster belief update property, but we also consider two variants. The first one, which we call POMDPS, consists in learning the exact belief updates. So rather than approximating belief using Monte Carlo sampling, we just compute it exactly, and for that we use the fact that computing beliefs is much faster in that framework. The second, that we call POMDP for past aware POMDP, is based on the idea that in our applications, so taking the recommendation example that we had before, what we want is a system that will be applied to a stream of new user every time. So rather than using the standard POMDPS, which is just looking at this tree of computations and just discarding it, we add a caching system to retain past histories in future executions. So now that we have MEMDP specific solvers, the question is how do they perform in practice? So the first application we're going to look at is recommender system. So as was done before, we can model a recommender system as a MDP. However, this assumes that we have a fixed environment for each user. And instead, using MEMDPs here allows us to kind of handle different user profiles as different environments. So first we looked at the synthetic settings, and the idea here is that we have full control over the number of environments, the number of states, etc. So this allows us to analyze a bit better how the algorithm performs in terms of speed and also performance. So first observation here that we have an MDP baseline. Basically the MDP baseline is just blind and doesn't see any different environments. And that's why its accuracy is so low, because here in that setting we had a setting where environments are quite different in terms of transition function. And because of it, the MDP does not perform well in the sense that and because of it, the MDP cannot find a function which performs well for all environments. Then we go towards MEMDP formulations here. So first here we see that the PBVI based one just runs out of memory, and that's why we also look at another solver, which is POMDPS. So first we see that indeed using the exact belief update here always perform best and also faster, so simply because we do not have to do any sampling. A second observation here, so if we compare simply POMDPS to POMDPS again, POMDPS perform much faster and slightly better. So this showed that having this caching system really improves speed of the method. However, we also see that comparing POMDPS and POMDPS with exact belief updates, we do not see such improvement. And the reason simply seems to be the case that just computing the belief exactly is just much more beneficial. In the second step, we also looked at the real-life datasets. So here the main difficulty was how do we define what environments here. Basically we have a list of users and a list of recommendations and choices they've made, but there is a lot of different ways how we can cluster these users together to form a user profile. Here we simply look at entropy-based measures. So what we do is we just build environments in a greedy manner. Based on the list of users, we simply collect users which diverge the most from the average behavior, and we just collect them iteratively to form environments, and we stop once we've reached the number of environments we desire. So what we see here again is first that the MEMDP-based method performs better than the MDP ones, even though the improvement is smaller because here the environments are much more similar. And the second thing we see that also that we can obtain good runtimes, which means again that using MEMDP-specific solvers is a faster and more efficient way to run things. So the second experiment we look at is the standard maze problem, where here we have an agent that should find some target in a maze, but has a certain probability of skidding. So we have some probability that simply the actions which is sent to the agent is not realized, and instead of random action is sampled at random. So essentially this means that we have a fixed maze, but we have some skidding probability which is unobserved, and we base our environments of the MEMDPs on these different probabilities of skidding. So here I'm just going to show the results as a plot, where you see on the y-axis is a crash and success rate on left and right respectively. On the x-axis is simply that we increase the probability of skidding for the agent. And you have two curves, so orange is MEMDP-based solver and blue is POMDP-based solver. So what you see is that here we have a clear two-phase diagram, in the sense that when the skid probability is high, which means when the environments are actually very different, then we see that using a MEMDP-specific solver really improves performance of the model. While when the probability is low, then that means that we have not so many differences between the different environments, and then using standard MDPs make more sense simply because we do not really need to have something specific to the different environments. So to conclude, I would say that MEMDPs are a quite simple tool to introduce some additional context in MDPs. And while they are a subcase of POMDPs, so we can use simply POMDP solvers, but we can significantly optimize this by considering the specific structure of the MEMDPs. And finally, we verified this in practice, and we looked at different applications as well as different settings in terms of number of states and environments, and we particularly focused on the recommendation systems, where we show that these MEMDP-specific solvers really perform more efficiently in terms of speed, runtime, and sometimes also accuracy. Thank you for your attention.